Hello, everyone. Oh, and welcome. I'm Mary Chatel, curator at MoCDA, and today we're here to talk about the exhibition Do Not Touch, and it's our second panel around this show, which is happening right now in Decentraland. The show presents the works of Sasha Katz, Baron Lanteigne and Martina Menegon, and it opened on the 9th of April and is now extended to the 3rd of July. So if you haven't seen it yet, go. Then I'd like to quickly introduce the show. So Do Not Touch is about moving out of the traditional IRL museum where we're forbidden to touch and looking at the metaverse as a materially removed space where it is safe to discuss the many realities of the palpable. The exhibition is about digital art exploring the tactile and the different emotions it can trigger, from sensuality to pain, joy to anger or fear. Away from examining the self-representative nature of the body, the focus lies on material behaviors. We look at skin as a semi-permeable and sensory feature. Skin appears as a boundary and a space for connection, but also a space for satisfaction or repression, and basically a sensor through which we interact for better or worse. In doing so, the show ponders a dialogue between human and post-human conditions. So as you see, we have many people with us tonight, so I'm delighted to introduce Baron Lanteigne, who is now being exhibited in the show, as well as Patrick Haggard, Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London, and Louise MacFadyen, an independent researcher and writer, as well as a Google design advocate. And tonight, for the second panel, we'll have the opportunity to discuss the present and future of haptic technologies. So, hi to everyone, and hello, Baron. And so before we dive deeper into the topic of haptic technologies, I'd like to give you all the opportunity to shortly introduce your practice and research around touch and human and machine interactions. And I'd like to invite you, Baron, to start perhaps.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me, and nice to meet you, everyone. So I'm an artist mostly active with visual art at the moment, but what triggered my passion for art and creation was actually sound and music. And so I've been in the past designing synthesizers and sequencers and instruments that were meant just for me to use, so my own instruments to interact with. So the interaction between myself as an artist and the tools I use to create always has been the core of my research. And I've always been fascinated by how indirect creation can be when it comes to digital work and interacting with softwares or instruments, to the point in which in some cases designing the instrument that I interact with takes more space than the result of my experimentations in my work. So I like, it's not literal touch, but it's the lack of touch that has been guiding me towards this process. And I've been trying to present this lack of touch and trying to imagine how technology could be interacted with differently through my work. So I don't know if we can share my screen, but I would like to quickly show a project that I presented with MoCDA, among others. So tangible data for me was a way to imagine our relationship with the virtual, and it was also a way to document my experience with the NFT markets through pieces, animated works that were meant for social media. And the project was also an opportunity for me to prototype different ways to exhibit those works in sculptures that I ended up making in real life. So what I'm showing right now is just a prototype of a physical exhibition, but I ended up making this sculpture IRL as well. But right now I want to focus on the animated works mostly, so I will switch to a different website. So here is another form of gallery, of online galleries, we could say, where I'm just showcasing all the works at the same time. So we can set the moment. Not all of them are loading. Let me try to refresh. I'll focus on what we can see, I guess. So I'm trying to imagine hard drives or screens as if they were melting, as if we could interact with them. And as you can see, I'm not really focusing on what we see in those screens, but mostly the fact that we should be able to manipulate those screens and touch them. I think that's enough for my small presentation.
Yeah. So maybe,
I'm so excited
yeah.
to talk with you all.
Great. Yeah, no, and it's great that we get a visual of your works as well, so that we see how you deal with the different forms of reality and handling devices as well. Patrick, would you be so kind to introduce yourself and your research on haptics?
Sure, yeah, I'm Patrick Haggard. I work at University College London at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. And my job as a researcher focuses on trying to understand the relationship between the way that our brains process stimuli on our skin, the way that touch is relayed into our brain, and then the subjective experience that we then have. So we can study the sense of touch by controlling a stimulus which we can deliver to a volunteer participant. Very often with touch, we stimulate the fingertips because they're extremely sensitive. And then we can ask the person what they perceive. So that tradition in scientific research is called psychophysics. It's the relation between the psychological sensation and the physical stimulus. And touch is just fascinating from that point of view, because the way that we perceive touch is highly labile. So we're touched by our clothes all the time and we don't really feel it at all. But then if, let's say, somebody that you really like touches you, then that will become the dominant moment in your consciousness. Also, if you dislike them, it will be even more dominant. So one of the things that's surprising about touch is it seems to switch in and out with a very, very strong attentional gain. There are another set of things which make touch a very interesting sense to study. So we don't just have a single sense of touch, we actually have several, because in the skin we have several different kinds of sensitive cells called receptors, which all pick up on slightly different kinds of touch. So the receptors and the neurons and the pathways to your brain that are activated by a steady pressure, like squeezing your finger, are actually completely different from the receptors and neurons and brain pathways that are activated by a kind of buzzy touch or a time varying touch of the kind that you get if your mobile phone starts to vibrate, or if you run the ridges of your fingertip over a bumpy surface. So for example, if you haven't shaved and you feel the texture of your skin, then that's running through a completely separate set of neurons. So we've got these multiple systems of touch which give us this extremely rich and extremely diverse experience, which can be very central to our mental lives. So touch, as well as being perceptually interesting, is often extremely emotionally rich. And for example, designers know that if you buy a product, let's say it's something like a kettle, the first day you care about what it looks, but if it lasts 5 years, every day you'll care about what it feels like. You'll care about what it feels like to touch it. And very often the haptic sensation of interacting with a pleasant or an unpleasant object has enormous power in our affective memory. So there are lots of interesting and unanswered questions which we investigate in studies with healthy volunteers by asking them what they perceive when they touch a stimulus, but we can also investigate the brain directly by recording with electrodes placed on the scalp, or by using MRI scanning. So there's lots still to find out about touch. And one of the things that's, I think, particularly interesting and particularly sort of focal at the moment in touch research is the idea that there's a pathway for emotional touch as well as for perceptual touch. And I'm particularly interested in how these sense of touch is related to our sense of self. So you mentioned that the skin is the boundary of the body. It's the basis of all our interactions with the external world. And I think really my myself is just everything that's enclosed within my tactile sense. Thank you.
That's a great introduction to dive into the topic. Louise, please tell us about your research as well, so we can know more.
My name is Louise MacFadyen. I'm a writer, researcher, and artist, and my work is generally around spaces, systems, and inequity. At Google, I generally work on a design system, which is a way that we give access to design to a wider group of people that can initially have access. And then independently, I generally research a number of different areas that pertain to my interests, including trying to quantify the science of ergonomics, writing about the internet as a leisure space. I have a podcast that I work on where I talk with my co-host about the history of the internet, knowing that it's something that happened sort of 5 minutes before we were already aware of it. And I also write a lot about third place theory, which is the theory that we exist as people in multiple spaces, and those spaces have different implications for us socially. So first places are our homes, second places are our work, and third spaces are places we go to socialize and enjoy being around other people. And it's been a really interesting and fruitful time for that research because of COVID. We generally saw that third places was the first places to close down and the last to open up. And so a lot of my research has been looking into what we lose when those spaces close, why they're so important, how we can recreate them online, and what cannot be recreated online. Like, what's the difference? Why can't we, for instance, recreate a bar successfully? And I think with that also, how far we want to push that. Do we want to be trying to completely recreate this extremely detailed world that we live in online? What do we benefit? Is there something new we can create? So yeah, very interested in the ideas that we are in need of having people around us at all times, and we know that we can touch starved, but what can we recreate? Are there new feelings and sentiments we can recreate through online touch connection?
Great. Well, so perhaps one question to get you all into the topic. So as Patrick mentioned, nowadays, tactile technologies, they remain selective. What are the intended use for haptics that you are most interested about? Could be anything like the palpation of objects or people, like projecting sensation or handling devices. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So maybe Patrick, do you want to start?
Well, I was hoping that Baron would start actually, because I think you're the creative. You're creating the new things. So I could start, but I prefer to hear where you see the future direction, and then maybe we can.
Let's switch. Let's switch. Baron.
Sure. Well, what I'm really interested in right now is not necessarily trying to adapt the new technologies to reproduce the real, because it seems that it's something that a lot of people are trying to pursue, which is fine. We need progress in that field. But instead of recreating the real, I think those technologies are more interesting when they are used in their own way for their own strength. So like I was very inspired by what Louise just said about like how far do we want to push immersion online? How far do we want to push technology that integrates all of our senses online? And I think we should question that, because maybe that's not the point of this new medium. And so what I'm mostly inspired with when it comes to this medium is not necessarily recreating the real, but finding, like, for instance, in my explorations with 3D creation softwares, I'm using tools that are meant to recreate liquid simulations, cloud simulations, or reproduce how the light bounces on different kind of surfaces. But what fascinates me is when you push the limits and you break those tools and adapt them, modify them, they end up creating some stuff that is, well, it's easy to call them surrealist, but it's a different kind of matter. So I'm still beginning this exploration, but I'm looking for a new kind of matter, a new kind of physicality that emerges from tools that were meant to create the real, but I'm pushing them elsewhere and seeing what happens. I think both directions are important to explore, but that's I'm interested in what does not exist. I'm trying to find a new color, even though that's probably not possible. But it's like an open field for me on that aspect. And another thing that enables this to be an open field, I believe, is that this technology evolves faster than the pace at which I can adapt to it. So it's always challenging, it's always fresh, there's always a new toy, and there is the risk of just falling into like connecting the new toys together and calling it a day and calling that an artwork. And well, I'm having fun doing this, but I think it's important to go like to focus on some of those matters. So it's there is so many possibilities out there that sometimes I try to blend a few of them with, and I have to give up on some others that like I could not delve deep enough in everything, right? So out of everything that is available to me, where I'm having the most fun with in that exploration is combining some tools that are maybe not meant to be combined and see where this leads me, but sticking to those processes long enough to call it my own. So I kind of see it as making my own medium, and even though it's really far from being a medium of itself, but I'm having a lot of fun building something that I can call my own process, something that is very important to me in that kind of exploration is that I can explore long enough to find something that I haven't seen before, and also break things. I consider the mean of diffusion, the way I can present this work, I can change it if I need to, and I can that's what the digital medium allows, that maybe real life is not as flexible when it comes to that. Everything is compatible and everything can be translated from one to another, so that opens a lot of possibilities when it comes to converting sounds into images, or just mocap data into visuals that are not meant to be driven by that data. So this kind of playing field to me feels like it shines when we're not trying to emulate the real life with it, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Great. Well, it's super interesting, and it also brings an advantage to seeing touch as being selective in the way it's expressed right now. Louise, Patrick, any thoughts about like the potential of haptics, and which technologies interest you specifically in that spectrum?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Baron, the way you talk about your work. When I was taking a look, it appeared to me that there's like an understanding and a reflection of like permeable boundaries with what is a digital space, and reflecting that back to how we behave in those spaces. And I've kind of become very interested in that recently. I learned about a pair of boots that people could wear to simulate walking that would like reduce the amount of motion sickness people felt when they were in VR. And it gave me the impression of an increasing like set of armor that people would wear, like a way that you would like place yourself fully into something. And so for me, the idea of like immersion has become fascinating because we end up kind of cocooning ourselves in order to have access to all these different feelings. And I'm not really here to say whether that's good or bad, but I do think that it's interesting. And I think that we'll seek to find where the correct amount of input is. There's definitely different levels. There's like a vest you can wear for a video game that will like give an artificial gunshot. And that's contrasted with an experience where you might want to just have like your hair touching your face, or you might want to feel a very different thing. Like, where did those become simulated? For me, at the heart of it, it's about storytelling. Like, everything we tell are human stories, and how is that touch helping that story? I think that we'll see ourselves go all the way to one space and be really extreme about haptics, and then probably find like a midline that tells us the key things we actually want to know, rather than wanting to feel and replicate everything exactly. But yeah, I'm excited to see where that goes. And at the same time, like, as I say, a little skeptical that it's going to go all the way and be successful.
I think different settings call for different level of immersion as well. And we saw that with Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces, where people don't necessarily want to use the webcam all the time when they discuss. And there is value in eliminating some senses in our online interactions. So there's the desire to make technological, our contact with technological realms as realistic as possible. But I think there is a strong desire to sometimes cut those sensors as well. Cut those, yeah.
Could I just pick up on some really interesting things that you've both just said? So I entirely agree with something you said, Bertrand, about the ability to make new stimuli and the ability to take the tools, put them together in crazy ways. I mean, that is so exciting and gives it an unparalleled advantage for digital in providing sort of new and therefore very salient stimuli for the brain to get into. But another thing that was said was relates to your comment, Bertrand, that the technology is developing very fast, and your comment, Louise, that maybe we're not going to go all the way towards total haptic immersion, because I think there's a problem here. The technology is evolving really, really fast for visual technologies, and your work is a really great example of that. You can produce these astonishing to watch, kind of slimy and disappearing objects, which are just great to watch, but nobody's actually touching them, right? They're not actual tactile objects. We're watching video effectively of haptic interactions rather than having haptic interactions. And I think one of the problems is that the haptic technology for delivering haptic stimulation is still really very basic. And what we can do with haptics is really limited by the limitation of the actuators. So particularly on the consumer side, right? So to produce something which gives a haptic sensation to somebody, but is also safe, is not straightforward. So the engineering of the actuators and the stimuli is a real problem. In a research setting, we're able to use sort of non-consumer technologies. We're able to use special stimulators, which are not practical for everyday use. We make sure they're safe, I can assure you, but we can deliver quite a wide range of stimuli rather than just giving vibrations. I mean, so much of haptics is just a little vibrating motor. And I think for me, the really exciting thing will be the new actuators. If we can get our colleagues in engineering to produce new ways of delivering functional touch, not just to the hands, but all over the body, and particularly sort of moving touch. So these kinds of stimuli are very important in terms of the brain's perception and also for transmitting emotion. So I think novel stimulation is going to be really interesting. In my own research, I've actually got very interested in thermotactile sensation. So I've got very interested in the relationship between being touched by an object and the feeling of warmth or cold, which is often extremely strong. So, stimuli that we like tend to be warm, and cold stimuli tend to be unpleasant. And how does that work? Well, it works because of the connections to the brain of the different receptor cells that tell us about cold and warmth. But also when we handle an object, we get strong thermal sensations from it as well as tactile sensations. So that's the area that I think would be fantastic if the colleagues in engineering can crack it.
Just to jump in before we move on, I find that area really fascinating, particularly because it's not just about receiving touch with haptics, it's touching something else. As I was saying earlier, like touching hair, or when I was first thinking about this area, I was very interested in the performance artists of the 70s, like Yoko Ono and Marina Abramovich, and their performances where they invited the members of the public to use different objects on them. Yoko Ono to cut her clothes, Marina Abramovich laid out a feather, a gun, all these different textures. And I think that, Baron, your work makes me think of this, the idea of an artist being present for that interaction. But at the same time, I'm also like, where is the ability to simulate, right? So you can simulate something touching you potentially, and you can simulate that heat, but like simulating a texture seems like the next area. Like how is that possible to frame out, you know?
Yeah, that's a real engineering frontier. So we can do those kinds of things in the lab, and we can do laboratory experiments which will help us to understand how, for example, texture perception works and how thermal perception works. And I mean, one great topic which has been studied a little bit is the perception of wetness. So how do you perceive whether something is wet? And Baron, when I saw your hard disk go all slimy and squidgy, then I was thinking, well, it's become a liquid. And there is a little bit that's known about that, but we're just a long way off deploying it at scale. This is a concern. It's still in the lab.
Yeah, maybe one way to achieve it is not to recreate the physical phenomenon, but to trick our brain into imagining that it's happening, even though it's not happening.
So if you deliver cold, you can actually trick people into feeling wet. So sensation of wetness is strongly linked to thermal sensation, and part of the job of people like me who work on tactile sensations is to try to understand those. I mean, you could call them brain hacks if you like, but those sort of ways to optimize the transmission of a sensation to the user, often by perhaps less obvious routes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love that it reminds me of an aquarium I visited as a child where you can reach your arm in and feel the texture of an eel, supposedly. It feels like you're reaching your arm in and feeling like this mysterious new texture, like new opportunities that can be created, and something maybe stranger than we already know. I mean, I know we're not touching eels every day, but
Great. Well, just a quick questions. Baron, in the catalog interview, you mentioned how we can be more or less conscious and active in our relationship to devices, and I wanted to ask you to expand on that, and then we'll delve into more questions.
Sorry, what do you mean exactly?
So for instance, when we interact with a keyboard, for instance, like the sense of mediation can be strong, whereas like some devices are more tactile and we're less conscious of these interactions. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on these different types of interactions and how it is important to you to feel the mediation or not.
Right. I think most of those technologies we take them for granted. So we, as users of this technology, I often hear people who are not at ease with those technologies. Instead of trying to blame the technology, they blame themselves, and it should be the technology that adapts to us and not the other way around. And we take those for granted. So like the keyboard layout, for instance, is not a new invention, and not many people are trying to reinvent it. We just adapt to it. I don't think it's probably not the best way to type, but since if we learn it, we stop questioning it, and if we don't learn it, we kind of blame ourselves because everyone around us is comfortable using the same QWERTY layout, and we even we transpose that layout that was meant for an actual keyboard. We transposed it to the screen just because it's what we expected a keyboard to look like. So I feel like a lot of new technology is wrapped up in skeuomorphism that just allows it to be delivered to to us as consumer without requiring us to learn completely new things. And well, that might be good to market new products quickly, but I don't think it's a service in the long run to us as a way to interact with technology, because we are in this loop where we just we use what's out there, and we are not challenging it enough.
I'd like to expand this question to Patrick and Louise. Do you think that mediation should be physically noticeable, or do you think it should remain seamless? Like I'm sure, like from a neuroscientific point of view, for instance, there is pros and cons in feeling this interaction.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. And I think, as I was saying before, at the moment, it's not seamless. So haptic interactions with technology are not seamless, mainly because the haptic stimulation is so poor. So when we interact with haptic devices, they might buzz, or they might click, or they might jump up and down, but they seem to lack the richness that our everyday tactile experience might have. So, I was just buying some fruit, and I squeezed the fruit to check if they were ready to eat today. And I was able to make, well, I haven't eaten it yet, but I think I made the correct judgment. Now, there's just nothing in the digital or artificial space which allows anything like that subtlety of interaction. So obviously, from the sort of consumer and the product and the immersion point of view, yes, I think we do need to have more immersion. But I would just like to put on a slightly different hat. I'm always interested in research ethics. And in fact, we wrote a paper on the ethics of virtual reality with some colleagues a few years ago. And there are some interesting ethical questions if virtual reality gets too convincing, right? Because then what is real and what is not? And that's something that I think people perhaps need to know, or maybe even have a right to know. What is this a game? What is exactly the significance of this event? People need to have the context to understand the experience that they're currently having. And I think one can imagine a perhaps fairly remote scenario where touch simulations and touch engineering becomes so convincing that you might actually fail to realize what world you're in. And I think I'd be a little bit cautious there. I mean, one of the things that's very characteristic about skin sensation is it gives us this sort of immediate physical, direct sense of interacting with the world. It's useful to bump your toe if you're walking in your apartment and you bump into something. It's fundamental importance to have a sort of veridical sense of how you are an object in a world of other objects. So there might be some interesting ethical problems if we're able to completely trick the brain with artificial stimulation. But that's a long way off. At the moment, just getting convincing haptic immersion is probably worth trying, and the less mediated it feels, the better. We just need to think about where those red lines might lie.
I think this makes me think of Louise's research actually on third spaces, and something we've discussed prior to this talk, which was assigning specific behaviors or environments for touching depending on spaces. And perhaps, Louise, you could tell us a bit more about this and your vision of also behavioral synchronizing.
Absolutely. What Patrick just said reminded me of a book that I'm actually reading at the moment, where a woman is describing she doesn't like to order groceries online because, for exactly that reason, she can't touch the peach and make sure that it's ripe. And I think that crosses over with some of the commercial implications as well of haptic technologies. Yeah, sorry, would you repeat the second part of your question, Marie? I'm so sorry.
So the question was about behavioral synchronizing online, and like the different types of mediations we could see in like different spaces, and how it could we could set, for instance, rules or different behaviors depending on different spaces.
Absolutely. I mean, touch, any kind of feeling is a message that's being sent, right? It's a form of communication. And during COVID, we saw like a touch starvedness, people going to events in public and going and engaging in behavioral synchrony, which we know the human brain really enjoys. And so that's things like football games, where you get to sing along and sing in sync with people around you, or you go to a church, or you play music with people. Something that I think about with virtual spaces right now, like Decentraland and the metaverse, opportunities there are like feeling music together and feeling like that rhythm in your chest, like a really loud concert, and you feel people around you dancing, and you have like engaged synchrony there. The other side of that, of course, is that we know that synchrony can sometimes take us too far, and sometimes we don't get to isolate and think about how our behavior are independent. And I wonder whether that's an opportunity that VR and haptics, I suppose, present to us, is to engage with that side of the human brain more rigorously and think about why we do what we do. But ultimately, sometimes I think that during COVID, it would have been nice for us to have had a little more adoption of these technologies, because it meant people could have maybe engaged a little further or more deeply. And I think that we'll see that going forwards, but because we've sort of had this on-off switch of going away from the public and coming back, I think it's confusing now for people who even just want to invest in the space to see if it is going to be fruitful to invest in the future.
And yeah, and just to go on this, I think the way this was handled during the crisis was we did not really care about the impact of cutting those senses for so long.
I think we cared about it, and we rapidly realized how much we were missing it. And I think at one of the first meet the public events that the British Prime Minister had, the first question he got was this very nice lady who said, "When can I hug my grandchildren?" Right? So, I mean, touch starvation is absolutely true. And we've been working in a European project called Touchless AI, which is an attempt to deliver touch without touch using ultrasonic stimulation. So you can effectively produce focused ultrasound, which can deliver light, not strong, but light stimuli to the skin without any actual contact. So it's a kind of mid-air haptics. And that, I think, potentially offers the possibility to just scale up and have a level of touch which could be, for example, at a distance, or could be shared to many people who all had the same tactile stimulator. It could be shared in a very, well, perhaps a democratic kind of way. So, all of us have a skin and all of us have the capacity to use it for sensation. Understandably, there are quite important social conventions around touch for good reasons. But I think one of the things that would be quite important is this idea of sharing. So you talked about synchrony, Louise, and the examples you gave are all examples of people moving. But in fact, if you can just give several people the same touch experience at the same time, they tend to sort of want to talk about it and want to share it, and they sort of feel that it's, can you feel it? And this is perhaps rather unusual, because we think of tactile sensation as being exceptionally private, which it is, right? Because it's my skin, which is based on my body. But there are some interesting technological possibilities which I think need to be explored more. So, for example, including the idea that when two people are in a conversation, or perhaps in some kind of shared space, that they could share tactile stimulation, they could share bodily sensations as well. And I think that would probably be a rather interesting experience and a kind of novel form of communication which could be digitally enabled.
That's very interesting to bring like other non-verbal information to complement touch. And I actually wanted to touch upon this idea of physical distance and getting into one's intimate zone. And especially I was thinking, and when we go, for instance, in Decentraland, like these avatars, they cannot really touch, they cannot really interact physically. And I wondered, about the visual information in the act of touching and how it becomes important for even like body representations to come close to each other and interact physically. Does that have an impact? And I know, like, for instance, Baron in the catalog said, Because we cannot touch virtual matter literally, I began using motion capture to drive the simulations and indirectly influence the outcomes, which I think is also very interesting to this idea of like representing touch as a way to compensate the lack of touch.
Yeah, this reminds me how I began talking about my practice, how I was started with sound and everything. It's very common in sound to not just trust your ears, but get a visual support confirming which frequencies you're dealing with when you mix. So I guess that to me it comes back to looking for ways to touch my creations, and since those creations are virtual and like driven by software and exclusively software, it could not be done elsewhere. I'm looking for ways to get closer to this virtual matter, to this data, and mocap is a great way to have a very intuitive, spontaneous, imperfect, fast data that is that makes my systems react. So it's not even comparable to touch, because it's not the same sense. It's mostly about gesture, but it's a way to use a different interface to communicate with my creation and to reduce the disconnection I get with the software, because it's crazy how many layers there are when you create with a software. You interpret what the software tells you using either speakers or monitors, visually or the sound, and you have to interpret that and then translate that with keyboard and mouse or touchscreen, which is not like, it's weird to call it a touch screen, right? It's the flat glass. So there are so many layers of translation in our thought process that it's a very indirect contact with creation. So I feel like those challenges apply as well to the development of haptic devices. It's like there is still a very big filter in between the senses of touch and the device itself.
Patrick, you were talking at the beginning of the talk of the psychological information versus the physical information when we're dealing with touch. Do you have a complementary point of view on this question of visual?
I think, first of all, if you look, for example, at Baron's current work, it's clear that vision can do something pretty powerful, which is, I don't know, faking touch, simulating touch, making us think about touch, somehow evoking touch-related sensations in the absence of actual touch. So, vision is perhaps often thought of as our dominant sense, and in some ways it is. So, I think the visual artwork is a great way to get touch into the space. And I think the challenge for the future will be to combine it with real touch. And I'm not quite sure how that could be done. It might be done in ways which we just need to think about. I was very struck, for example, when you were describing the role of touch in performance art. So one can imagine that there could be digital visual artworks which would then be combined with some sort of performance, either that the viewer would use their body to interact with some objects, or perhaps that somebody would interact with the viewer's body. So maybe having a human in the loop is actually quite good to get the tactile aspect integrated with the visual digital aspect. So I think that's certainly one area of importance. I think another thing which will be quite interesting going forward is to try to move beyond hands. I mean, I was quite interested, Baron, that you showed these works involving hands handling objects. And of course, our hands are one of our major interfaces to the world, but our tactile sense is not confined to our hands at all. And in fact, the face has an enormous astonishing tactile sensitivity. And for example, at UCL, quite a lot of our experiments, we find it's easier to study sense of touch on the lips of our volunteers rather than on the fingertips, because it can be more sensitive. Now, in the digital world, that might actually be rather sort of possible, and there might be sort of fewer barriers than exist in IRL for touching people on the lips. So I think it's necessary to think a little bit outside of the box about what sort of invocations of touch we can use going forwards, and how we can find a good fusion of digital possibility and human sensation. I think it's a really underexplored and novel space.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That is spot on. I think so. The same way the visual medium illustrate textures to talk about the sense of touch, the hand symbolizes that in the same way. So it's mostly used as a symbol in this case.
I think also, like, when you're talking about digital spaces, we're always also talking about like how life has been replicated on those historically. So the digital space Second Life, for instance, was somewhere that people went to find relationships and to cultivate different communities. We know that that's really, really important. And so like, I love the symbolism of like the lips, the hands, these have entirely different messages. Something that I think is also really vital is that we do always try and find the commercial aspect for these spaces. And we know that the doctor-patient relationship can be improved by a handshake. And I wonder, like, if there's other implications of trust that doesn't technically have to be like a touch, but even just witnessing that. Like, I've had like telemed appointments, and I occasionally wonder to myself, like, would either of us come away with a different, because it's an exchange of social identities, right? At any time you touch someone else or you're even engaging with them. I just wonder what the implications would be, even just to visually recreate that in a digital space.
Great question.
Patrick, any thoughts?
Well, there's a concept which is quite heavily researched called the peripersonal space. So we monitor different regions of space in different ways. So the space which is close to my body has a particular set of brain circuits dedicated to monitoring it, and there's this idea that there's a boundary of peripersonal space which I protect, whereas things that happen in far space perhaps neither here nor there to me. So one of the things that our skin does is provide the ultimate sort of boundary of personal space, and it's strongly related in our sort of defensive responses. So you don't like people touching you unless you have given them permission or you know who they are, and those kinds of things. So I think those are all important biological functions and biosocial functions. But there are also areas where I think there could be potential creativity and potential interesting novel experiences. So an artistic interaction is one of the cases where there is a sort of a relatively shared, or there can be a relatively shared space between people. For example, audience members or gallery people visiting a gallery, they'll get exceptionally close to each other, and they can also get exceptionally close to an artist in some cases. I think the performance art examples that you gave are good. So art potentially allows a level, or artistic scenarios allow a level of trust and interaction, which makes our peripersonal space safe, not too safe, perhaps, because art should also be edgy, but it allows us to permit others to stimulate us, including tactilely. And I think that's a sort of a privilege and an important area for future development. So I think, for example, I was just wondering what sort of gestures could I make, or could somebody make with me to augment the evocative kinds of things that were happening in your visual displays. So could this become a multimodal sort of experience where while watching these sort of interesting haptic events, there was somebody was caressing or touching or squidging my body? I think it would be very intense, and you have a situation where it's difficult to do, but maybe it's possible, and as long as it's ethical, then maybe it's also interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the concept of art opens up to so many possibilities. However, in most cases, when it's presented, I find the context to be quite a lot more sterile and constrained. So it's kind of art serves many purposes, and the freedom we get when we create is its strength, less obligations, more freedom. I feel that opens up to many creations. But unfortunately, when it's time to present, there are so many restrictions that tame down all forms of creation. So it's not. It's inspiring actually to work within those constraints, and it's challenging. It's more challenging for that reason.
I actually was thinking of this when I was looking at your work and thinking about the idea of something hurting you. Like, we don't use haptics to hurt ourselves, but of course, like, there is the gamut of touch, and one of those things is pain. And thinking about that, like bullet vest, for instance, why do we want to recreate that? What is, as you're saying, does it feel too sterile? Do we have to push this? I was looking into Decentraland and noticed that some of the characters can wear tattoos. They're like NFTs, and they can put tattoos in their skin. And I thought about what the implications are of a tattoo that's not been put on your skin in that painful way. You know, would we ever desire to recreate the pain of a tattoo? Probably not. But does that mean that we look at that tattoo with a different implication than we would in a real person? Probably yes. So like, I sort of see what you mean by the sterility. Like, we don't have as much engagement, and I think that has a little bit less of the, I'm not sure what word I'm going for there, but like the grit perhaps is a little mitigated.
Super interesting, yeah.
Sorry, I wonder if I could just come in on that.
Yeah,
I think this is a really interesting point. So how can we more strongly harness these elements of touch? And I think one potential future field that could become interesting is wearable. So there is a field called wearable computing. And if you can get the soft hard interface right, you can get quite interesting electronics built into clothes. And potentially the idea that the entire skin of the person can then be used as an input medium, can be used as a sensory medium. So you can monitor people. You can monitor their skin temperature, which is a very clear indicator of their state, their emotional state. And you can also provide particular patterns of stimuli. So again, the engineering and the actuation is not great, but the potential, I think, is very strong. And it's interesting that so far the wearable space has been purely functional. It's been purely about biosensing. And the actual possibilities of using it for experience generation and experience recruitment and immersion have so far really, as far as I know, been largely neglected. And I think that seems like a really cool direction to think about in the future.
Mm-hmm. In my work, I only interact with technologies that are available to consumers. So I think this first step of having something utilitarian available to the consumers allows artists who just play with it and by luck end up on different results. So it's a slow process.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, I think, like, as Louise, you mentioned, like this idea of like not only bringing pleasure, but also like pain or different emotions, because this also set limits. It set limits to the freedom we can have in virtual realities, but at the same time, like it brings more information. So as you said in the beginning of the talk, like there's this balancing act coming up where like we see whether we should like have more understanding of the virtual world or just like step out, but then like it's less immersive. So yes, but we're past time, but like there's been so many great insights on this talk. And it was lovely to have you all. So I think it's time to conclude, but I wanted to thank you for joining us on this discussion around haptic technologies, and to hear about your vision about the relations we'll have with hardware. So before leaving you, I'd like to remind everyone that is listening to this talk that the exhibition Do Not Touch is still on view in Decentraland until the 3rd of July. And you can learn more about the exhibition by ordering a copy of the catalog. It's a great catalog. There are 2 introductions, one by Filippo, Lorenzin, and one I've written. And along that, we have special artist interviews, including an interview of Baron Lanteigne, but also Sasha Katz and Martina Menegon. And the link is available on MoCDA's website and on all our social media profiles. So do come visit the show and do read this catalog. We've put great effort in producing. So yes, and thank you again, Patrick, Baron, and Louise for joining us today. It was really lovely to discuss haptics with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.